Yay, my logo. Okay, so I'm a geek, so before we do anything, I'm going to start with a test. Everybody comes to me in these conferences and say, can I add you to my LinkedIn? So I'm trying a new feature of LinkedIn. It's not new, but it's new for me, where if you go to My Network and you say, find nearby, it will scan the room and it will see my phone and you will be able to add me from there. Obviously, you'll see each other, so you're going to all add yourselves together. It's going to become a LinkedIn party, which I don't want, so don't tell me. But anyway, feel free to add me. I'm going to keep it on while I talk. That said, before I talk about open source, I have a quiz for you. How many people here think more than half of the Fortune 500 companies on the world use open source? How many think more than 60% use open source? How many think more than 75%? 90%, anybody? Okay, it's 95%. 95% of the Fortune 500, that's Gartner's number, use open source. And they all use it, and some of them are doing a lot more with open source. I'll talk about that a lot more. Another question, hey, and then we'll jump into the slides. Microsoft, you know, the enemy of open source, right? The guys who used to kill every open source guy they could see, is now running a cloud business, and they have servers, VMs, running on Azure. How many think more than 10% of those VMs are running Linux? How many think more than 20%? 30? 40? So the number is 50. 50% of VMs running on Azure are running Linux. That's to give you an idea that even the bad guys of the Linux world are now strongly interested in Linux. Actually, Microsoft just joined the Open Invention Network. They donated 60,000 patents to that foundation, which protects people who are doing stuff on Linux by having a pool of patents that they're making available to everybody who's doing stuff with Linux. So Microsoft is really also going into the Linux world big time. So just anybody here doesn't know what open source is? Okay, so this is source code on your left. Anybody know where it comes from? Raise a hand if you have an idea. It's a crypto library from OpenSSH. Lets people find bugs because the source code is available, compared to trying to find bugs in this, which is a little bit harder. That's what you can use when you're using proprietary software, right? Finding bugs is becoming a little harder. So the whole idea behind open source is that you can use open source software and you can tweak it in any way you want. You can modify it, you can study the stuff, you can redistribute it the way you want, you can add it to your own project. And basically that opens up a whole bunch of interesting doors for entrepreneurs and users alike. So I'm going to look a little bit into these doors so that first of all we have an idea of what can be done with open source. As Rutger said earlier, some people are afraid that larger companies are going to steal your open source project. We'll see how we can prevent that from happening. There are very interesting means to do that. So when people use open source, there's usually a definition, and the definition basically looks at open source licenses and says anything that claims to be an open source license must follow a certain number of rules. I'm not going to detail all of them, but keep in mind that the top ones are I can redistribute my code, I can have access to the source code, I can modify it, allow the right works, but I need to make sure that the original work remains available somewhere and that people can refer to it should they need to, and then you can't prevent anybody from doing whatever they want with it. So that's really important, okay? And that includes the fact that in general, no, all open source licenses let you do commercial applications of it. The devil is in the detail, how you can do that. So in the open source world, we have three families of licenses. And they go from being the most permissive licenses where basically you can do whatever you want with the software. There's actually one of them which is called the do what the fuck you want license. Look it up, it's there, it exists. And it basically says you can do whatever the fuck you want with my stuff. And then the Q&A says, can I do that? Yes. Can I? Yes. Can? Yes. It's very simple license. It's actually close to the BSD license, which basically says you can do whatever you want with this as long as you keep my name and the copyright and the license terms. But permissive licenses let you do whatever you want, including put that in proprietary software and not give away the source code directly, especially if you've tweaked it. You have to point to the original source code. You have to say, this is what's inside. Like Mac OS has BSD inside. You have to know that it's BSD. They have to tell you, but they don't give you the source code directly. They don't give you the source code to their modifications. Then we have licenses in this category that let you basically modify the stuff as always, but the modifications you do have to be open source. So if you have a very fancy piece of operating system and you modify a driver because it runs better on your hardware that way, that modification must be made available to the users. So the original obviously is available, the original copyright is available, but things you modify have to be available. But you can add anything to it. So you can take software with a license like this and you can put that inside a commercial application, and you don't have to give your commercial application source code away, but the original stuff and anything you modified must be made available. Then finally, there's a group of licenses here, which is called, negatively, they're called viral licenses. They contaminate everything you put next to it. It means that if you take one of these such licensed software and you modify stuff, the modifications need to be open source. But more importantly, if you add stuff to it, everything you add to it has to be open source as well. And that's the kind of license people will try to use when they want to restrict big companies from taking their source code and putting that into their own commercial application, because suddenly their own commercial application becomes open source because of the license, or else they get into very significant lawsuits. And even the big guys like Linksys, bought by Cisco, get into trouble and have to go through some really nasty loopholes to get away with it. And usually they don't get away with it, they fix it. Come talk to me about Linksys later. It's a long story, but it's a fun one. So if you want to listen to the Linksys story and messing up with open source licenses, come to the Q&A. So licenses, this is what helps you tell your users, your developers, what they are allowed to do with your code, basically anything, and what they're obliged to do with your code. Redistribute the code, redistribute updates, redistribute everything they add to it, okay? So you pick your license based on how you want your community to interact with you, with your software. This is important because when we're going to talk business models, a license is something that will support a business model, potentially, or mess it up. So you have to be really careful, okay? And I just want to here clarify something. Anybody here ever heard the word open source business models? There is no such thing, okay? Business models are business models. They work with open source or non-open source software. Some of them don't work with open source software, but a business model is just a business model. So if you hear somebody talk about an open source business model, be smart and say, oh, there's no such thing as open source business models. It's like when I talk about blockchain and I ask who thinks blockchain should be regulated. Don't answer this right now, this whole other debate. Okay, so why do companies do open source? And there are multiple reasons, okay? The first obvious reason is it's dirt cheap, so we can use it for free. Yeah, and usually that doesn't work. If you do that way, you fail and you end up realizing that you have support costs, you have integration costs, you have services costs, you have training costs, it's a mess. So when you're gonna do it for that reason, you wanna think about it quite a bit and make sure you get things right. Make sure you prepare your stuff right. If you're going to do integration, make sure you work with somebody who's done that same integration before so that you leverage the integration costs and the work of getting all of that to work together. Or else you're going to end up with a project that costs a lot more than buying commercial software, okay? That said, if you're looking at open source from a financial perspective, think about better control on your budget, right? Where do I want to put my money? Where does it actually make sense? Like if I'm a university, maybe I don't need support because I have a whole bunch of geeks who just love the idea of tinkering with my systems and fixing them. That's how I started being an open source guy. I used to be a hacker, breaking the machines at university. And then the IT manager said to me, you know, Gilles, don't break the machines. Can you want to help us set them up? And ever since that time, they've had students, part of the IT team, that count as, you know, points for their studies, and they're doing the support. So they don't need support. That's cool. Sometimes you don't need training because you have a whole training division and they just need to learn a little bit how to do the stuff and then they'll do it for you. etc., etc. So think about where you want to put your money. Think about things like OPEX versus CAPEX. And for an investor, this is really important, right? If I'm investing in a money who's bought a whole bunch of stuff, it's not the same as investing in a money that's just using OPEX to run off the cloud, and all of the money I'm investing in it is in talent, is in knowledge, is in things that actually have value. Because if I'm investing in thousands of servers purchased somewhere, 5 years from now, these servers have zero value, regardless of what's being run on them, okay? All right, another reason why companies do open source is innovation. Actually, I talked to a lawyer some time ago who said, you know, Gilles, open source sucks from a legal perspective. And he was joking, don't get me wrong. It sucks because when companies do open innovation, they usually work with us and then put in place all kinds of NDAs and CDAs and contractual agreements so that they can share knowledge on a common project. With open source, it's so easy. Take your software, put in a license on top of it, pick the right one, etc. Put it on a repository, and then you tell all of your competition to work on it. That's what Allianz did early this year. They've taken their core insurance backend software, they've open sourced it, and they said, we want all of our competition to look at it, to contribute to it, and to use it. How cool is that? No lawyers involved, at least beyond the figuring out the right kind of license. So it's a great way to actually do open innovation. It's actually a great way to do innovation in general. One of the Sun founders said once, innovation happens elsewhere. You know, the only way to think out of the box is to have people from outside the box who are doing the thinking. So when you put your source code out there, people from outside are going to look at it and say, oh, what if we did this? And then start coding at it. And then you're going to look at it initially and say, what? You can't do that. Then you realize they've done it and it works and it's, oh my, it's such a great idea. Your marketing people or your innovation people probably would not have thought of it. And people from the outside who are using the stuff, they did. So innovation, really, really good means of using open source. Speed to market. When you have more people contributing to the code, when you have more people writing the software, it goes faster. As long as your processes to manage it are okay, as long as your governance is okay, etc. But it can go a lot faster. When I was at Sun Microsystems, the Japanese government came to me and said, Gilles, we've asked Microsoft, we have a new version of the extended kanji character set, which is officially now used in Japan. And Microsoft has said that they would update Microsoft Office to support the extended kanji character set. And it'll be the next release, which is given their release cycle in 2 years, and we'll have to upgrade to that. That's cool, we're okay with it. 2 years is okay, we'll wait. Can you upgrade OpenOffice? At the time it was OpenOffice, now it's LibreOffice, but can you fix OpenOffice so that it has extended kanji character set? And I looked at him and I said, no, we won't, but I'm going to help you do it yourself. So I helped them put in place a team of font experts, C, C++ programmers, designers, etc. And made sure their team had a link to the development team of OpenOffice, because the development team of OpenOffice was at Sun Microsystems, and I knew these guys, and I made sure the link was there. So they did it by themselves. Less than 2 years? Less than a year? Less than 6 months? Yeah, 2.5 months compared to 2 years, okay? It gives you an idea of how fast it goes when you do things by yourself and you don't have to wait for a release cycle. Microsoft probably did it faster, but they were stuck with their release cycle. And that's what happens when you use proprietary software. You're stuck with somebody else's release cycle. When you use open source software, there is a release cycle, but you can write your own stuff, add it to it, contribute to it, and if it's really interesting, it will be included in the next release cycle, but you wrote it, you're already using it anyway, and it's benefiting your enterprise. So think about it as time to market is a really, really good aspect of open source. Okay, marketing tool. Yeah, because people use open source to market and to do marketing and communication. If you have a look at Novartis. Novartis is a company that is a pharmaceutical company, right? So pharmaceutical companies tend to not really communicate a lot about the stuff, you know, the patents and formulas and things like that. Well, if you go to GitHub and search for Novartis, you'll find they have a whole website, which is for a team that does ontology, which is a dictionary of terms, as well as DNA sequencing. And they publish DNA sequencing algorithms on GitHub, which is like, what? Novartis? Yeah. Anybody contributing to it? Nope. They're just doing it to show off. Okay, so they're using this to show that they're the best on the planet. And they're not the only ones to do this kind of thing. Using open source to suddenly become the center of attention because they might be publishing something cool, or they might be the ones who's driving a community, and then they're seen as the expert, et cetera, et cetera. As an HR strategy, oh, this is a really cool one. I work with companies that come to me, and you'll obviously understand why I won't name them here, that come to me and say, Gilles, you know, we're in a really nasty market, people don't want to work for us, like, maybe this is not the case, it's the other ones. Maybe they're doing like mass destruction weapons, you know, or anti-personnel mines. Nobody would want to work, you know, for a company who does that. So what do? They have high salaries, okay? They have really fancy campuses, nice view on the Lake Geneva. That'll let you guess. And they say, well, you know what? We use open source. And for those of you who are working in our IT team on these open source projects, you're encouraged to contribute to these projects on the fancy salary we pay you. And that is really motivating for people who do open source, because people who do open source, not only do they have fancy stickers on their laptops, I just put one on mine today. It's a new laptop, so it only has one. But not only do they have fancy stickers, but they believe in things, and they contribute to things they believe in. And that is a significant part of their work motivation, actually better than the salary. Managers don't listen. But open source people will actually work for a lower salary. They work like in governments, you know, or even in communities. Where's the salary there? Because they're doing something they believe in. So if it's a company that's doing something that has a negative perception, but the developers are encouraged to contribute to open source and are being paid for that, yay, that works. So who was that? I think it's Deutsche Bank who said that they're hoping to attract key talent by open sourcing some of their code. It's an application called Waltz, like a dance. Google Waltz, Deutsche Bank, you'll find their repository on GitHub. And they're really saying that. We're doing that because we want to have more people, you know, who are interested working for us. And they're not the only ones. These guys are not doing it for negative images, obviously. They're doing it because they're really good guys. And then there's ethical reasons. You know, governments do open source because it's the right thing to do. For example, in a republic, res publica in Latin means it's a thing that belongs to the people. So software that's being developed by the government should also belong to the people. What best way to do that than to make it as open source? Somebody in the French government once told me there's also a budgetary issue. We see open source, the cost of developing open source inside a government, as a zero or positive budget. Why? Because we pay developers, but those people are usually based in France, example of the French government, which doesn't work, by the way, for my company because we're an Indian company, but anyway. But they pay the developers in the country. Those developers pay their tax in the country. They purchase food in the country. They rent a house in the country. They go to the movies. They basically make the economy work. So the money that is being paid by the government to pay the developers directly goes back into the economy. And then it creates knowledge, which creates value, because then these people, when they leave the government, they create startups and they do other things. So the overall budget, even though there's a cost for the actual team who's paying that, from a governmental perspective, from a national perspective, it's a wealth generation system. So it's very cool. To do open source for this kind of reason. You know that you're making your country a better place. So with that in mind, now that you know why you should be doing open source, let's see how we make open source attractive and how we look at investors. So, you know, how do people get their money for their project? The first place to go is a bank. You know, if you create a company, the first thing people do is they go look at a bank. And when you go look at a bank, you realize suddenly that the bank is really not interested in what you're doing. They're going to look at your risk model, and if it fits their risk model, they're going to loan you money with an interest rate that is their interest rate and that might be aligned with the market interest rate, and that's about it, okay? And that's it. If you don't fit the risk model, they're not going to invest. And you can tell them whatever you want, they're not going to invest. So it could be a little hard to work with a bank if you're in a very risky mode, like a startup that's trying to do something completely new and the bank doesn't really understand how it works. I've been there. I co-founded a company that sells still Linux-based self-fixable, sustainable laptops. And makes like, what the hell? How are you going to make money with things that you don't have to sell over and over again, since people can fix them for 20 years? Anyway, so that's the first thing, banks. Then you have venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are really cool. I like VCs. Venture capitalists are good because they understand your business. They're bad because they have to believe in your business. So you have to go to them, and you have to tell them what you want to do. You have to convince them that what you're going to do. is interesting for them, that it makes sense, and that they're going to make a shitload of money. A VC is not there to get a 3% interest rate. They're there to make 100 or 1,000 times their investment. That's what they want. Now, the tricky part with a VC, and here I'm French. So in French, VC is investisseur de capital risque, which translates roughly in English into an investor in risk capital. The key word here is risk. Normally, a VC takes a risk in investing. When you go talk to a VC today, maybe in the dot-com time, before the dot-com bubble, they would take risk. Today, when you go talk to a VC, the first thing they want to see is traction, revenue, numbers, growth, and if your model is, if you're profitable and you have all the money you want, then they'll invest. It's like, why am I coming to see you? They will invest, by the way, if you have some very fancy serial entrepreneur like Jeff Bezos in your team. That might convince them without even looking at your business model or your traction or revenue. But in general, when people like you and me, well, certainly me, when I go talk to a VC, they look at me and say, where's the money? So that's a tricky part. That said, when they decide to invest, they give you smart money. And that's important for the second part of the slide. The nice thing with smart money is it comes usually with knowledge, skills. They might put a CFO in your team. They might put a CTO in your team. They will help you grow your business. They will bring you to potential customers. They're active in it. Why are they active in it? Because they want to get their money back, and lots of it. So they will make sure you're successful, or make sure. They will do as much as they can to make sure you're successful. So VCs, you have to convince them, but if you convince them, they're really cool. They're really interesting. If you can't convince a bank or a VC, in the modern world, we look at shared economies. So the old version of shared economy is crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, whatever, where people go to these websites and say, I want some money. We're looking for $300,000, $400,000. And by the way, if you pay $100, you'll get a free copy of my product. If you pay $200, we'll sign it. If you pay $400, you'll get a dinner with the team. And $500, you get a T-shirt, in addition to the previous stuff. And that works. That works. There are quite a bunch of projects that work that way. But the tricky part here is that some of these sites might not want to invest in your product or support your product's crowdfunding option. In particular, if what you're doing isn't necessarily completely ethic or is something like a sex-based project. There is porn sites that are looking for funding, and that wouldn't work on some of these crowdfunding platforms. So you have to find another way. So the other way came around when suddenly Bitcoin arrived and everybody suddenly could get money and put money somewhere. And then finally we had smart contracts that arrived with the Ethereum space, and people started trading coins, tokens, and using this distributed model of payments and investment to actually look for money. And it's called an ICO, roughly. So the idea here is to say, okay, we're going to let all of you who want to participate in my project by purchasing tokens. And that's going to make money for my project, and I'm going to use it to make my project successful. And that last part of my sentence is really important because that's a claim. And there's no guarantee about that. That's why the regulators today are looking at ICOs to make sure that things don't go south every time people invest. The last number I heard is that things go south about 50% of the ICOs today on the planet. So it's a little tricky. And by the way, if you haven't seen that, go to this uetoken.com website. It's an ICO generator. You go there and it generates a brand new ICO with white paper and a token and a very fancy website. And basically it says, please invest in my token. I guarantee you will get nothing back. It's honest. It's completely honest. This one is honest, but it shows you that anybody can create an ICO that has zero return, zero guarantee of return. That said, what I like is that anybody can do an ICO, even if a VC doesn't understand your project. Okay, so if you are doing something that is hard to explain, that is completely innovative, and VCs look at you like, you guys are crazy, which, by the way, happens a little too often, that's an option. What I like, so I don't like, as an investor, I don't like ICOs. I'm a lousy investor, by the way. If I tell you I bought this, sell it, okay? I'm that kind of an investor. That said, why I don't like ICOs is because there's no guarantees. What I do like is when a VC has invested in a startup, done the due diligence, pointed a finger at the people who are in there so that you know who they really are. They can't run away behind, hidden identities like the guys who created this porn industry ICO that had tokens that people could use to buy porn content. And then when everybody invested in the ICO, they just poof, vanished. Oh, and by the way, when they did the ICO, they said, we can't tell you our identities because, this is really tricky market, so we want to protect our privacy. Yeah, sure, that too. But, so what I like is when you have a startup that has VC funding to get the initial money, to get, support, driving, making sure they go in the right direction, and then they do an ICO to get additional money or to enable people to interact with them in different ways. That's a really cool model, okay? But the general, yeah, we need money, let's do an ICO, I tend to stay away. Okay, so let's look at some business strategies for the last half of this presentation today. Let's look at some of the business strategies that can help VCs or banks, well, not necessarily banks, but investors look at your project and decide that it makes sense for them to invest in, okay? So when you're doing open source, it's a little tricky, right? Because if you remember on my open source definition, the first line in there was anybody can redistribute my code and do whatever they want with it. So that tends to mean that there's no point in trying to sell the software, because if you sell the software to me, I'm going to redistribute it for free to everybody else. Or I might actually resell it for free to everybody, for some money to everybody else, make a profit without giving any money back to you. So in general, open source is seen as free because it can be redistributed by anybody, and that tends to kind of kill the selling the runtime license model. So rather than say, I'm going to sell you runtime licenses for free stuff, why not design my business model around that free stuff in various ways? So first thing is, my product is made as open source, okay? So that's one way to do open source. I'm creating something open source, and I'm making that available as a product in various ways. It could be software that can be downloaded and run. It can be run as a service, etc. But my core software, my core product is open source. Okay. The next one is building with open source. So here I'm building a product that has a bunch of open source inside. Okay. So that's going to lower my development cost. That's also going to make my development faster, because the people who are developing these open source libraries tend to go faster than I would, and they have the skills which I might not have. So building with open source is interesting, but you have to be careful when you start integrating open source into commercial software, because if you mess up the license, Linksys, anybody, come talk to me later, as I said, then you get into real trouble. So building with open source requires very, very cautious study of licenses involved. Building for open source is having a business model that's there to support something based out of open source. So for example, I'm a services company like Wipro. We're a system integrator, okay? So we really work well with open source products, right? We do develop some open source, but for most of our customers, what we do is we take open source products and we integrate them. So we sell a service or a custom development, a product, sort of, to a customer, and that is there to support the customer's open source stuff. So we will sell integration, training, support, etc. Around open source. And finally, building my business on open source. So building my business on open source is saying, okay, I'm building this open source stuff, and I'm going to build a complete business model around this open source stuff, and the open source stuff, I'm just going to give it away. But my business is built totally on the open source. So some example, and I'm going to give you a few here of companies who built very, very successful open source based business models, or very successful business models that leverage the fact that they're using or pushing open source. So first of all, Amazon is an obvious example. I should actually now, in this slide, I should actually add Microsoft here, because Azure is starting to turn into a huge open source factory there. Interestingly enough, they probably have, coming from Microsoft, who would have thought of that? They probably have one of the cleanest, most standards-based open source cloud offerings on the planet. They don't have, for the Linux-based environment, they don't have proprietary interfaces, they don't have proprietary APIs, they just run the default, Kubernetes stuff over Red Hat. So if you want something that is, can't believe I'm saying that, having worked for Sun. If you want something that is really open source, very clean stuff, try Azure. It's like, wow. It works. That said, Amazon is pretty cool. Google is not as nice because they have their proprietary APIs, and if it runs on Google, it's hard to port to something else. But if you run it on Amazon and you're not using too many of the Amazon custom APIs, you can actually push it on Azure and it'll work. Netflix is also interesting because they're delivering a service. That service, you know what it is, it's videos, movies, etc., streaming content, and all of that stuff is running on open source. And they're really good because they're contributing all of what they're doing on open source. They're contributing that back. So they have huge repositories on GitHub, and you have people who are doing very fancy stuff on tuning multi-threaded kernels. There are people, ex-people from Sun, actually, really cool guys, and that are doing really fancy work on open source to make Netflix run really fast and really stable and scalable. And it's all on open source, okay? And nobody doubts that Netflix is profitable these days. Wrong button. Yeah, okay. Selling services and support. Roguewave is an example, but because they sell support for open source packages. But the one I'm going to talk about here is really the system integrators, like Wipro, who we are, but we have a whole bunch of competitors as well. The idea here is that a system integrator is not necessarily somebody who develops anything, but takes stuff and puts it together with some fancy glue and make that available to a customer as a solution for whatever problem they have. And whether that overall solution is for the customer only, meaning the glue might be proprietary, or designed to be open source. Some customers actually come to us and say, we'd like you to develop this for us, but we want it to be open source-able, in the sense that we want to make sure that all the code you write is compatible with an open source license so that we can actually put that stuff on GitHub should we want to. Okay, we can actually do the work. Some good system integrators will do the work for the customer to turn something into open source. It's not trivial, but it's interesting to be able to either build things with OSS components or even integrate some non-OSS stuff properly so that it works. If you're taking something like MongoDB and you put it with some non-open source software, you get into trouble. So when you want to do this kind of thing, you have to think about it a little bit, and it requires some expertise. Hardware, Cisco. Cisco is the owner, or was the owner of Linksys. It's tricky. I'll just put it this way: if you have open source software inside hardware, and you sell that hardware, and somebody realizes that there's open source inside, and that open source is based on Linux, they can ask for all of the source code. And that gets tricky when some of your source code wasn't designed to be open source. Linksys routers, they have Broadcom chipsets for the Wi-Fi. And Broadcom usually doesn't publish software, open source drivers. And when the community realized that Linksys chip routers had Broadcom hardware inside, they said, oh, we like all of the source code, including the drivers. And so there was a big legal battle, and I realize I'm telling you the story, but I have a few minutes. There was a big legal battle, and finally Linksys decided to publish the source code, all of it. And they're doing the great thing, by the way. If you go to GPL Download Center, if you Google for GPL Download Center Linksys, you'll find all of the software for all of the routers based on GPL Linux core inside. That said, once they published their source code, what happened is that Broadcom came to them and said, the source code for the driver, it's not open source, you shouldn't be doing that. Actually, we don't want you to do that. So they had to have an intense negotiation, get rights to publish the source code. That was fixed, and they could publish the source code, and people started hacking into these routers, which were extremely popular because you could hack into them. And then they realized that the drivers, inside the drivers, you could actually change the transmission power of the Wi-Fi chipset. 42 milliwatts, that's the law. 200 milliwatts, that's the chipset. So if you look at a Linksys router with Broadcom hardware and an open source firmware, you can actually change the transmission power. The more recent ones, the hardware blocks it. But the older ones, it was just software. So people started tweaking their routers so that you had a bigger range on them, which was really cool. I could finally cover my house and the garden. Until telecom regulation authorities came to Linksys and said, yeah, we can't let you sell these routers anymore because they're too easy to hack. So sorry, but you have to take them off the market. Okay, that turned into quite a nasty situation for Linksys, which had OEMs like phone networks using their hardware to build their own devices and sell them or give them out in Spain. And suddenly they weren't allowed to make these devices. So what they did is they took their hardware and they said, okay, we'll make a non-open source version. The WRT54G version 5 and above are based on VxWorks, which is proprietary, tends to be smaller as well, which is nice because suddenly you don't need expensive hardware, you can use cheaper hardware. So they started selling these routers, and then the people at FON said, no, we're not happy with those because we can't put our own software on them because it's not open source anymore, it's not Linux-based anymore. So Linksys said, okay, let me think about it. And they said, okay, we'll come out with a new version of the routers as well based on Linux, the WRT54GL. L for Linux, but we'll sell it at a higher price point so that the average user buys the non-modifiable one, and only the serious geeks will buy the more expensive one who wants to buy something more expensive, right? Except me, because I'm a geek. And for the OEMs, obviously, the hardware was available, etc., at the same conditions. So if you look at putting open source into the hardware, messing up your licensing story, it can change your commercial strategy, your licensing strategy, your distribution, everything. And if you don't react well, suddenly you have a product that you can't sell anymore. So so be really careful when you're embedding open source into something, whether it's hardware or something else. Okay. Samsung, everything that's built on Android has open source all over it. So you can make a lot of money by selling hardware that includes very free software. It works well, okay? Dual licensing is interesting. My software, I write it, so I control the licensing model. I can make MongoDB and make it available as a community version, which everybody can download, and put an extremely restrictive license. The MongoDB license today is AGPL. It's a version of the GPL that says, however you access my software, even over the cloud, if you build something based on that software, everything you add to it needs to be open source, even if you're making it available over the cloud. So like, think Google, you access Google over the cloud, okay? Google never gives you the source code of what they have in there. Well, now they're starting to, but in general, they don't give you the source code. So you don't know what's running behind the Google engine or the Gmail engine. If MongoDB was inside Google, suddenly they would have to make everything open source, even though they're not giving it to you or distributing it to you, but you're just accessing it over the web. So that's the MongoDB licensing model. They have this license, which is extremely restrictive. Some companies actually don't allow using MongoDB internally, because that license, if somebody build an application on MongoDB and put it on the extranet, would suddenly mean that everything that's connected to it, possibly all of the internal IT, becomes open source. That can be an issue. So MongoDB has another license. They also sell you MongoDB commercially. They own it, they can do whatever they want. They sell you commercially, and they say, if you take the commercial version, that comes with a no strings attached. You can integrate anything, you can connect anything to it. We're letting you do all that you want with it. Can't redistribute it because it's commercial, but at least you can connect all of your stuff, and your stuff doesn't have to be open source. It can be proprietary as well. So the company who's decided, and I'm not going to name them, I don't like naming and shaming, but the company who's decided not to use MongoDB, actually, I think they made a wrong choice. They should say, we're running commercial instances of MongoDB, which you can use, and there's no issue with that. And that protects them from having to publish all the source code outside. But that's the business model of Mongo. They say you have a community version, which is really nasty from a licensing perspective, because everything that touches it has to be open source. If you want to do something not open source, we'll sell you a license and we'll make money from that. Okay. Commercial, open source with commercial upgrades. So there's like a free core software, and then on top of that, you can add stuff that is going to be commercial. So for example, MySQL, you already have some examples here. So MySQL, the community edition is really nice, but if you want multi-threading, if you want enterprise metrics, etc., you have to pay for the commercial enterprise edition, which, by the way, people who develop MariaDB don't like, so the MariaDB has all of the enterprise features for free. But that's the world of open source. You can always find something that does what you need in a different way. So that's an interesting model, actually, because you drive interest in your product by having a community version, and then you generate revenue by having commercial extensions to it. Don't make the community version a crippled version, because that upsets everybody. So make sure your community version is useful. Make sure you can do stuff with it. And make sure that the extensions are really for people who need these extensions instead of just being something to try to steal money from users of the community version. It wouldn't be very well perceived. Okay. Other example is people who are actually selling things like subscriptions that include support, maintenance, etc. on top of open source. Red Hat has a community version, which is called CentOS for the server side and Fedora for the desktop. So you can use CentOS and Fedora if you want for free, and you can do whatever you want with it, and you get support from the community. That's cool. But they also have Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Red Hat Enterprise Linux, what people don't know is that you can actually go to the website, download it, and use it. There's nothing stopping you from using Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But if you want to use it in production, you're probably going to want support. And Red Hat will sell you a subscription to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which includes regular updates and support and everything you need to run it in an enterprise context. And that's how they're making the money. And by the way, if anybody here is doubting the validity of that business model, anybody heard about the IBM acquisition of Red Hat? Huge amount of money spent for that, okay? And by the way, Red Hat some time ago acquired JBoss, which was built on the same model. People who developed an open source product and selling support on top of it. And the guys who are doing JBoss, by the way, they're colleagues of mine when I was at Sun Microsystems in France in 1994. They're now retired, which I'm not. And they have a very nice retirement, believe me. So it's a very, very efficient model saying, we have a product that's free, you can use it for free, but we'll sell you a subscription that lets you have enterprise class support on top of that product. Okay. Those are people who are doing open source from a strategic perspective. Remember when I said communication and marketing? That's an example. People who are saying, we are going to make sure that you want to use our products because we're doing open source and we are nice guys. Microsoft, nice guys. Who would have thought? So we're going to do open source. We're going to contribute open source to the rest of the world. So you use our stuff. And Microsoft, you pay to run on Azure. Google, you actually pay with your brain time on their advertisements to run Gmail, but the idea is that you pay in a way to run their software, and you like it because they're also contributing a lot to the open source community and to the open source world. So basically, you want to make sure that that you figure out, how you are going to want to generate your revenue, how you're going to leverage what you're doing directly or indirectly to do your monetization. So think about your business model. And I think if I put it in this slide, there's not much about open source in this slide apart from the dual licensing part, and even that might not necessarily be dual open source, non-open source licenses. So these things are not specific to open source. They're really business models. Do I want to generate my revenue directly from my product or indirectly? And that's a business model decision. That is not an open source decision. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this, but really, before you do anything, think about your strategy. Why are you doing this? What do you want to achieve with this? If you start by saying, we're going to do open source, yay, cool. And then you go talk to a VC saying, yeah, we have an open source product, invest. Business model? Why? So think about, why are you doing your stuff? Why are you doing it in open source? What do you want to achieve with open source? Do you want to drive adoption? Do you want to drive recruitment of people? Do you want to go fast? Do you want to innovate? Think about the good reasons for doing open source, not just because it's cheap. And then, when you've decided that you want to do open source or not, then you think, what is my business model? How am I going to make money with this stuff? Okay. And by the way, if you decided not to do open source and then you say, this is how I want to do business model, this is how I want to generate money, maybe open source comes back into the picture by being a way to drive adoption. So don't remove it from the board initially. It might be a very good option to drive adoption. So thank you very much. You have my LinkedIn, you have my Twitter, you have my name. You don't have my email, but you'll find it on LinkedIn. And I will be available for the decentralized Q&A afterwards, so for the rest of the day until the end of the drinks and bites. Cool.